We're getting ready to start our next grammar bits, number 10, and this will last us probably through Christmas, and as we review all of our different varied sentences and try to put them together, will really be a focus for the rest of the year. So we started out by doing a quick review of varied sentence structures that we've talked about so far, and these are some of the sentences that kids have used in their favorite font, varied sentences paragraph. The introductory prepositional phrase, which starts with a preposition, one of those words we had to memorize on our list, and then is followed by either a noun with some modifiers or just a noun by itself. The second type is an introductory adverb, and we've been so far talking about adverbs as words that end in ly. And then introductory infinitives, and we've recognized those as to plus a verb, not to be confused with our prepositional phrase that starts with to, which would be followed by a noun. And any of these first three introductory phrases we've talked about have to have a comma after them if they're put at the beginning. If a prepositional phrase or infinitive or adverb are anywhere else in the sentence, you don't need to put a comma after them, only when they're used in the introduction. Last week we finished up our talk of compound sentences, and we said that you can make those using a comma conjunction or a semicolon, which is what I've called a more sophisticated type of punctuation mark. In either case, there has to be a subject and a verb on both sides of the comma conjunction or the semicolon. Figurative language we've talked a lot about through our smiley face tricks, similes, metaphors, personification. Number 6 is the imperative sentence, which we use the understood subject as you. Another word for that is a command, telling somebody to do something, do your homework, look out for that bus. And then the last one is an appositive, and you'll always see an appositive after a noun. There will be a comma, and then there's going to be a noun phrase that follows it that tells more about what the appositive is. So this example right here actually is and a positive. So we're moving on now and talking about clauses and phrases, and this will be Grammar Bits number 10. And we started by reviewing what is a phrase and what is a clause, and we did this at the beginning of the year, a few weeks ago, and just explained that the difference between a phrase and a clause is that a phrase is just a group of words, whereas a clause is also a group of words, but it has a subject and a verb. And now, most of the times, we talk about clauses with subjects and verbs as a complete sentence. But now we're going to look at how a clause, can have a subject and a verb, but not be a complete sentence because it doesn't complete a thought by itself. So now we break our clauses down into two different groups. The independent clause, which is a complete sentence, and we kind of compared that to adults. They can do everything for themselves, work, pay their bills, buy a car, take care of others, versus a dependent clause, much like as students we were, or as children, dependent on our parents. And so a dependent clause needs an independent clause in order to make sense. And so that's really going to be our focus for the next couple of weeks, is recognizing dependent clauses. And we came up with this funny word, AWUBIS, which is really a mnemonic to help us remember that some of our subordinating conjunctions that help us find dependent clauses start with an A, or a W, or a U, or a B, or an I, or an S. By no means is this a complete list of every subordinating conjunction that exists in the English language, and actually we'll talk about some in class and add them to our list. That is a subordinating conjunction. Who can be a subordinating conjunction. In order that can be a subordinating conjunction. And so we'll continue adding to this list as we go. But what we're really going to be looking at now is identifying dependent clauses in sentences. This is really a much better way for kids to vary their sentence writing and show some growth in the way that they're writing. So the way we're going to be doing this in class is we're going to circle the word that signals or tells us that we have a dependent clause. So in this case, as long as is the signal word, And then we use that to help us find the dependent clause. So it starts with that signal word, as long as, and we underline the whole part of that phrase, as long as she's given the option. And if I were to say that to somebody all by itself, as long as she's given the option, it doesn't really make sense because the thought isn't complete. As long as she's given the option, what? Kelly will choose a lollipop over a chocolate bar. So put together, the dependent clause is dependent on this independent clause in order to make a complete sentence. Students were also very aware and noticing that we've been talking about commas, and since this is an introduction to the sentence, it needs a comma. But if we were to put this dependent clause at the end of the sentence and say, Kelly will choose a lollipop over a chocolate bar as long as she's given the option, we don't need a comma because it's not introducing the sentence. And so as students start writing their own dependent clauses, they'll also be required to be thinking about this, whether or not they need a comma. So, we started today, we did about 5 examples in class together by finding the word in this sentence that's also on this list or that signals a dependent clause, and that word here is while. And if while tells me I have a dependent clause, then the dependent clause has to start with while, and I have to find the end of it. While what? While I know that dinosaurs are extinct. Okay, so there's my dependent clause. If this is truly a dependent clause, I have to be able to find a subject in there. I am the subject. And the verb, what do? I know. And there's my subject and a verb telling me that I have a dependent clause. Now we want to look at our independent clause, the rest of that sentence, and make sure that it actually is a complete sentence too. And we had to have a little talk about the contraction I am. I am, when you put a contraction together like this, actually takes the place of both your subject and your verb. I am the subject, and then am is the verb. It's a linking verb. So we have to kind of watch when we have these contractions. Lots of medical research is being done on cancer in order that we may find a cure. Now if I look over here at my list, I didn't have it on my original. We added it, and so in order that is our signal word telling us that we have a dependent clause. If in order that is the clause, it's also the start, or is the signal word, it's also the start of the clause. In order that what? In order that we may find a cure. Now if that's the subject and the verb, or if that's the dependent clause, we have to find the subject and the verb. We is the subject. And what do? We find, but there's actually a helping verb there. We may find. And then we can come over here, and the first thing we'd want to do is get rid of our prepositional phrases here. We've got of medical research and on cancer. And so our subject has to be lots. And lots is being done, that whole verb phrase. It's got 2 helping verbs. Is, being, do is a verb, an action. So is being done is our verb phrase. Jazzy doesn't want to leave Universal Studios until she has taken the tour again. Looking at my list on that other page, until signals that I have a dependent clause. And that tells me where my dependent clause starts. Until what? Until she has taken the tour again. If this is truly a dependent clause, there has to be a subject in there. She is a subject. Has taken is the verb phrase. On the other part of our sentence, Jazzy is a subject, and does want, or doesn't want the way it's written, is our verb phrase, our verb. And so we're going to be doing a lot of practice that looks a lot like this, where students will have to find and circle the signal word, underline the dependent clause, and then find the subject and the verb in both sides. Now one more thing that we took note of as we looked at this list of AWUBISes is that we had several of these words that were also prepositions: before, after, until, as. And so we talked a little bit about how do we know if they're being used as a preposition or a dependent clause signal word. And we had to think about, what does a prepositional phrase look like? It starts with a preposition and ends with a noun, and there aren't allowed to be any verbs in there. So if we see before being used as a preposition, and it will look like this: before school, comma, I ate breakfast. If I were to kind of try to break this sentence down, I can see that I have a prepositional phrase, before school. I know that's a prepositional phrase because my preposition is before, I've got a noun at the end, and there are no verbs in the middle. Now we could change that to a dependent clause: before I went to school, comma, I ate breakfast. And so we've got the because again. The difference here is that there's a verb after it. It does end with a noun, but we can see that that noun is part of a prepositional phrase, to school. And so I am the subject. And what did I do? I went is my verb. I am my subject over here, and then ate is the verb. So we've got an independent clause, a part of a sentence that can stand alone. I ate breakfast. But when we put this dependent clause at the beginning, it adds a little bit more description: before I went to school. And so we can see before in both of those sentences. We've got school in both of those sentences, but the difference is that we've got a subject and a verb over here. And why does this really matter? Well, we're really looking at how do we vary the way that we're writing our sentences so that we can add more description and color to our writing. And so this is just one more way that we're going to be practicing. Okay, so this is the AWUBIS and the dependent clause.